Some time ago, as spring was turning to summer in New York City, the town was abuzz. The town was abuzz with talk of the homeless families that were coming, and their acute needs, which nobody could deny, and the very real question of whether the city could meet the challenge of accommodating them. This was not just a question of a temporary lack of financial resources. These people were totally disconnected from the economy. Their health was poor. They bore the scars of past discrimination. And they included not just unemployed, destitute adults, but also children. How to deal with them was not just a question of the city's moral compass, but also its practical capacity. I'm talking, of course, not about the summer of 2012 or 1986 or even 1933, but of 1710, when some 2,800 Palatine Germans, Protestants who'd been driven from their homeland in the Rhine Valley by a combination of war and disease, sailed to New York City, 2,800 people coming to a city of some 6,000 residents. 400 died on the journey. The city hurriedly tried to construct hospitals and tents and housing for them, but several hundred more died during the summer. And ultimately, in desperation, the governor at the time, whose name was Robert Hunter, ordered that the children be apprenticed, or some of the men would be apprenticed to businesses in New York City to provide for their sustenance. And this was done in some cases without the consent of their parents. Ultimately, many of the Germans were relocated and settled up the Hudson Valley, but hundreds remained here in New York. And indeed, poverty is as much a part of the history of New York City as the former Indian Trail known as Broadway, or the Revolutionary War routes that give us Washington Heights or Gun Hill Road. And we all know that that past is just a prologue to today's city, where roughly 1 in 5 New Yorkers is officially poor, where many, many more than that live very close to the poverty line, where some 50,000 people, men, women, and children, sleep in the city's shelters every night. And sometimes in our daily ebb and flow, discourse, or argument about poverty, we lose sight of that history and the fact that it underlies not just the phenomenon that we're all talking about, but also our attitudes about it and the way we've reacted to it with policy and programs. And so today we're going to talk about that history and some of the lessons it provides for charting a course on poverty in New York City today and tomorrow, and deal with the poverty that we still see some 303 years after the Palatines came and in many cases went. And to do that, I'm joined by a very distinguished panel, and I'll introduce them briefly. First to my right, for 16 years, Valerie Jean has worked with and for activist, progressive, and human service organizations in the areas of community organizing, housing development, youth development, management, marketing, program evaluation, and funding development. She is the executive director of FURY, Families United for Racial and Economic Equality, a Brooklyn-based multiracial organization made up almost exclusively of women of color who organize low-income families to fight for a fairer system. She also serves in the steering committee of Living Wage NYC, a labor, clergy, and community coalition. Nancy Waxstein, since 2002, has been executive director of United Neighborhood Houses of New York, the federation of the city's 38 settlement houses and community centers. Prior to her UNH stint, she was the executive director of Lenox Hill Neighborhood House. She was Mayor Dinkins' director of the Mayor's Office of Homelessness and SRO Housing from 1990 to 1991. And prior to that was a senior policy advisor in Dinkins' office as Manhattan Borough President. And down at the very end, but the author of the book that brings us here today, or the co-author, is Ethan Strudnick. He is a published historian with expertise in child welfare and public policy, and is researching the history of family poverty and homelessness in New York City. He has conducted extensive research into the history of public policy surrounding children's issues, and his work has been published in numerous scholarly journals and presented at conferences. He holds a PhD from the University of Virginia, where he wrote his dissertation on child welfare policy between 1945 and 1980. So let's welcome the panel. So what we'll do is we'll have a conversation among us for probably about 45, 50 minutes or so, maybe an hour, and then we'll open up to questions. And we'll try to get as many in as possible. So if you have a question, please remember it, because we hope to include everybody in the conversation. But I want to start first with Ethan, and looking at the book, in order to sort of understand this vast swath of history, you pick out certain themes, and one of them is about just how we conceive of poverty. And whether it's a question of personal moral failings or systemic structural problems, and there's been kind of an ebb and flow on that spectrum over history. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that has looked like and where do you think we are today on that spectrum?
Sure.
Now, why don't you share the mic?
Can you hear me?
Hello?
Hello? No?
Is that coming through?
Yeah?
It is.
Okay. I can speak loudly. It'll be fine. If you can't hear me, say something. The question was about kind of the ebb and flow between, one way to think about it, I think, is kind of whose fault is poverty? Is it the fault of the poor individual, the poor family, or is it somehow society's fault? And I think that in some ways there's ebb and flow, but both ideas have always been present in some way. You know, the earliest incarnations of this, the earliest ideas about poverty, the colony that was New York and later the early state, was really about morality. That people were poor because they didn't follow the proper moral order, they didn't go to church, they weren't upstanding citizens, upstanding Christian citizens. And so the solutions, and most importantly, they didn't want to work. And so the solutions often came in forms of punishment. The poorhouse, the almshouse, ways to punish people, to teach them the habits of morality, the habits of work. And that really continued through the 19th century, even as what developed what we would think of as more sophisticated ways of thinking about poverty, ways in terms of how does changed economy, changed in society, shape that. I mean, I think about the predecessor organizations, or two predecessor organizations to Community Service Society, the AICP, the Association for the Improvement of Conditions of the Poor, and the Charity Organization Society, who both sought to find ways in which, find ways to lift the poor, using their own, improving their morality, and using their own abilities to lift themselves out of poverty, rather than giving a handout. And today, I think that fell apart. I think the settlement house movement really, in the middle of the progressive era, in the middle of the period from the 1890s into the early 20th century, really pushed against that and said, let's look at the environment in which people live. Let's look at these economic and social forces that force people to live in poverty. And, but today I think we still have a mix. I mean, I think if you look at something like the welfare reform of 1996, there is this way in which the burden of poverty is pushed back onto the poor themselves. And I feel like there's a disconnect between how poverty is caused by these outer forces, but yet the solutions we turn to often are about working with individuals and forcing them to raise themselves up.
Sure. Why don't we, since you mentioned settlement houses, that's a natural segue to Nancy. And you know, the role of those houses in this history, not just about providing or working to alleviate poverty, but the thinking behind it. You know, what theory of poverty motivated the early part of the settlement house movement, and how maybe that's evolved along with your services today. Why don't you talk about sort of where you've come from and where you are?
So is this working?
Yes,
A little
it
bit?
is.
Okay. So the first question I usually ask when I'm on a panel like this, does everybody know what a settlement house is? No. Okay. So first of all, there's a very good description in Ethan's book here. There's actually a little chapter called, a little part of the chapter about the progressive era called settlement houses, so I'd encourage everybody to read that. But a settlement house, settlement houses were invented, if you will, or created in London in the late 1800s. Middle class, upper class people came and settled in to a very poor neighborhood of London. That's where the term settlement house comes from. They settled in to learn from and teach poor immigrant people. And that model, and to enrich their lives and to help lift them out of poverty. And That place still exists. Actually, I visited it a couple of years ago in London, called Toynbee Hall. And so early American reformers, like Jane Addams, who went on to found Hull House, and Lillian Wald, who went on to found Henry Street Fund too, I guess, went on to found Henry Street Settlement here in New York, and Stanton Coit, who founded University Settlement here in New York. They went over to Toynbee Hall to look at what was happening there, and looking at this not as a model of charity, but as a model of what we would now call community development, looking at the conditions in that poor London community, which is still poor, and transplanting that model back here to the city. So the first settlement house in New York, University Settlement, which still exists, was founded in, I think, 1884. And then in immigrant neighborhoods throughout the city, these places were established. So what are they? I can tell you what they were then and tell you what they are now. So there's been big evolutions over the last 100+ years in what they are, not with a dual mission to help individuals and families, as well as to change the social conditions which led to those individual and family problems that they saw. So it was the two tracks. But they emphatically rejected the charity model. The charity model just helped somebody with their individual problem. They were hungry, give them food. They couldn't find housing, help them find housing. They did that, but at the same time, they wanted to address poor housing conditions. They wanted to address the lack of affordable milk, child labor, laws, etc. There were no protections for the individuals, and they saw that the problems they saw emanated from some of the social conditions. And that's, at that time, which is a phrase we still use now and then, from case to cause. That was the approach. They would see that there were cases, individual problems, individual, not individual deficits, but individual challenges, I guess. They did not see the problem in the individual. They saw the problem in the society. And so, at that point, also in the late 1800s, I'm sure most of you know, there was no government funding for services such as settlement houses. So they were supported exclusively through private benefactors. So when Lillian Wald founded Henry Street Settlement, I think in 1893, something like that, she had a wealthy uptown benefactor and named Jacob Schiff, and so one of the great investment banking firms. So why did he do this? At least in those days, we didn't talk about integrating immigrants into our society. We talked about assimilating and Americanizing immigrants. And so the sort of uptown Jews that had immigrated from Germany were frankly embarrassed that the great unwashed masses of immigrants were coming over at that time in the early 20th century, and they wanted to do something about it. They did not want their people, and it was similarly for Italians and Irish as well. So the settlement houses were really formed in this country to assimilate and Americanize the great masses of unwashed, uneducated, untrained people, and they did the job, and they continue to do the job. But I would say that government funding, which now supports most of the settlement houses, we have 38 now. Some of them are the historic, traditional settlement houses. Some of them are newer organizations that were formed for other reasons, which I can talk about. Or more, in many cases, majority funded by government, which of course changes the approach and changes the nature of the work, which I can get into later.
Let's stay with the energy question for a second and bring in Valerie, because we've talked with Ethan about the history of sort of policymaker elite explanations for poverty, and Nancy talked about sort of a particular vein of the reform movement. For someone who works at the grassroots, maybe you could talk a little bit about your work. The people you work with and work for, how do they explain the persistence of poverty? And what combination of moral and structural critique do they employ? Because I know there's often a lot of nuance to how they see the situation in which they and their friends and family participate.
Hi, well, I'll start with what Fury is about. And we were founded in 2001 by 15 women living on public assistance. And at the time, we were a project of another organization called the Fifth Avenue Committee. And when we started our work back then, what we were looking at was the issue of the work experience program, and that it was essentially forcing people into work, but not really providing avenues to have a sustainable future for yourself and your family. And one of the campaigns that we fought around in coalition with other organizations citywide was to pass and win the Access to Education and Training Law, which was later vetoed by Bloomberg. Surprise. And so from since then, that work kind of evolved to, well, if we're fighting for women who are living on public assistance to go to work, then surely childcare is going to be needed. And in many of the communities that we serve, childcare is provided in informal settings at the home, or better known as family-based daycare providers. And as we were just kind of like asking around, figuring out that these same providers were essentially working for about $2.19 an hour and have not received any subsidies in their, any increases in their subsidies for over 10 years. And so we fought for $4.5 million in back pay for them. Then after that, it just, everything just started, it just kept evolving. And at one point, we started to realize that if we really wanted to move and advance the strategies, the policies that we want to, that we had to include voter organizing or voter engagement as part of that strategy. One thing that we say internally in the office is like, where we don't have power in money, we have power in numbers. And so base building and leadership development is very essential and key to our work. And when we're going around in Ingersoll houses in downtown Brooklyn, this is 2005, knocking on doors, there weren't that many answers. So we're like, okay, any organizer will tell you, if you don't catch them at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you go back at 7 o'clock at night or 8 o'clock at night. And that's what we did, and still no answers. So we found one person who was living on the floor by herself, who said that, well, the housing authority moved them out because the apartments are supposed to be renovated, but they've been out for a while. As we did more research, we found out about the 2004 rezoning plan, which was part of rezoning of about 50 some odd different neighborhoods. That was specific to downtown Brooklyn, which is pretty much like, it paved the way for the Atlantic Yards to come in and created just a domino effect of impacts of market-led development. So we started the Accountable Development Campaign to push back against how that rezoning plan just pretty much, which we predicted back then, was going to create a huge pocket of poverty in the neighborhood that contains currently 3 public housing developments. But we also saw things like eminent domain being used widely to evict tenants from their homes, to the closure of hundreds of small businesses in downtown Brooklyn. Currently our campaigns include the Accountable Development Campaign. We also have a public housing campaign where we fight tooth and nail to preserve and protect public housing as the largest affordable housing stock or low-income housing stock in New York City. Our youth organizing arm started their campaign, and they call it the No Money, No Problems campaign. And they're very proud that they just released a report about 2 weeks ago where youth surveyed other young people and analyzed the city's and the state's jobs programs and how the job programs could be improved so that young people can actually benefit from it. And we continue on with our voter engagement work, and to date we've engaged more than 10,000 unique voters since we started that work in 2005, targeting unengaged low-income voters in a nonpartisan way, because we don't trust politicians anyway, to really stress the importance of being engaged from beginning to end in holding your elected officials accountable. Our organizational analysis around poverty is, one, not only is it systemic, but it's pretty much a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will. We go by, like, if there is no poverty, there is no wealth kind of analysis, where, like, a lot of these conditions are created to perpetuate things such as the need for increased police forces in low-income communities, to allowing private developers to draw down on tax abatements using the population that's there in a neighborhood to fund their mega developments that in turn don't help to house the families that we generally organize. And for example, downtown Brooklyn, which received about $7 billion in public and private investments, now has the poorest census tract in all of Brooklyn, where the average median income of a family now is $9,001 a year. And the adjacent census tract, which is divided by a one-way street from Ingersoll houses, the average median income is $83,000. And so that just shows how, like, the different policies that have been set in place have essentially created these just huge waves of economic segregation throughout New York City. We see it firsthand in Brooklyn, where, I mean, the way that we look at it is, we know that there are many great, organizations and people in academia and so on who are putting policies together, but we feel it's extremely important that those who are directly impacted by these negative public policies and practices are also at decision-making tables and developing policy recommendations that will help to not just alleviate poverty. We alleviate poverty now, but we look to ending it altogether. That's why, like, we have some reports that are out there where all the policy recommendations are there are recommendations that come from those who are directly impacted. It'd be easy for us to sit down and just write, like what we think should be in the law, but we'd rather spend months teaching low-income women, low-income youth, everybody who comes through our doors, like, this is how you develop policy. These are the key elements of it. This is how you target certain levels of government with it and have them come up with what it is that they want to see changed.
Let me pick up on something you mentioned about economic trends that kind of underlying poverty we have today, and that goes to obviously a big theme in the book is the kind of the interplay between the cyclical aspect of the economy of booms and busts, but then also a longer trend of change, irreversible change from, I guess, agricultural New York to manufacturing New York, industrial New York, and then to whatever it is we have now. Talk to me, Ethan, if you could, about what the interplay between those trends has been over time in terms of whether there has been some people used to call it the underclass steady group that was poor, or whether it has continued to vacillate, and whether people have changed their thinking about that as the economy has changed underneath the boom and bust cycle.
Sure. I mean, I think looking at the book, there's always been, in some ways, this population of the destitute. Unfortunately, there's always been.
Louder, please.
There's always been. That works, yeah. There's always been, when they first built the almshouse, there's 100 families that move into the almshouse, or dozens of families that move in, and soon there's hundreds of people there. But there's obviously ways in which that ebbs and flows. The creation of a manufacturing economy, really beginning in the 1790s even, created wage labor in a way that didn't exist before. In colonial New York, you went to get a job in some kind of industrial work, you became an apprentice. That means you moved into someone's house, they provided your meals, they provided your room, you were trained. Even if you became a journeyman, and you continued to be part of their household. You got taken care of in a way. By the early 1800s, that's gone. You have a system in which people are hired for wages to do a job, and then when they're no longer needed, they're laid off. And so that creates a large population of people that are living day to day looking for work. That takes a long time for the city and private organizations to really gain control of how to deal with this constant population of the unemployed, of the poor. And the same thing happens, I think, starting in the 1960s through the 70s and 80s. Even today, as we experience that change that you referred to as well, from an industrial economy to what we would call a service economy. And the difference being is that we haven't really figured out a way in which to include, some people talk about a bifurcated service economy, right? That you have an economy at the elite service economy, which is the lawyers and the stockbrokers that work on Wall Street. And then there's the low-wage jobs for the people who work in fast food restaurants and in the stores that sell things to those people. And that in this bifurcated service economy, there's no real way to move people out of that persistent poverty. The low end of the service economy keeps people poor, allows them to survive, but keeps people poor. There was something else I was going to say. Yeah.
Yeah,
Can
well,
I ask you-
just certainly jump in.
Not to sound too much like Valerie, because she can sound like herself, but does capitalism need poverty? Does capitalism need an underclass? I mean, I'm asking you
Yeah.
this as a historian, not as a
Right.
provocateur.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that through the historian's answer is that whenever there's been capitalism, there's been an underclass. So the historian's answer is yes, right? That we don't have cases in which we have this economic system without that. Not to say that there haven't been cases or ways in which to alleviate the worst of those issues. I mean, the other thing that's interesting to me is that in a lot of ways, and lots of people have written about this, but the way in which New York City's development really was planned in a way to move the poor into kind of isolated pockets. That from the 1920s, the first regional plan for the city was to move manufacturing out of Manhattan, to move the poor out of Manhattan, and to move them into more isolated, and that the places where industry would move would be the Bronx, would be Brooklyn, would be Queens. And so it's not surprising that we really have a city with a bifurcated service economy, but a city that's really divided between the increasingly wealthy Manhattan and pockets of real, Valerie's talked about, entrenched poverty.
That's an interesting question, because if you think about the government response to poverty, and the question about whether capitalism needs poverty to survive, the moment maybe in New York City history and U.S. history where capitalism faced its gravest crisis, the Great Depression, was when there was a real fear of there being a total change in how we organized ourselves economically, and that prompted the government to basically create what we knew for many years as the safety net. I'm wondering, Nancy, since your experience goes back a little further, before the period of welfare reform that we are living in now and have been living in, did that safety net succeed at kind of evening out the cycles that Ethan was talking about, even if it didn't address the underlying shift in the economy? Did we at one point have a solution to at least the cyclical problem, or have we never quite gotten there?
Well, I think certainly Social Security, made a difference in poverty among older adults. I mean, it made a huge difference in setting a floor. Not that I go back that far when Social Security was created, but it made a big difference. As did AFDC. If people don't remember what AFDC is, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, which was also a New Deal program, also in response to the Depression. So yeah, I mean, I think they made it. As did the some of the public housing and fair housing, because it assured that people would have, that their housing would meet certain standards and that they would have a income floor. So that addressed poverty. It took a lot of people out of poverty. But I guess the question is that the goal to just create a floor, or is it to do more than that? So I don't, I still believe that policies can make a difference, even if, there is something about our system that requires low wage workers and poor people. You can lift the bottom to some extent incrementally. So I don't agree. I feel very strongly, based on both the New Deal experience and the Great Society experience, that policy makes a difference, legislation makes a difference. It doesn't equalize for all, but it makes a difference.
Valerie, today we have in the city, if you looked at the numbers of people receiving cash assistance, whatever the unemployment rate did during the economic crisis of a couple years ago, the welfare receipt line was flat. It might have even gone down. At the same time, you had a very dramatic rise in food stamp usage and Medicaid usage. what role is the safety net as it exists playing today? Is it helping to alleviate poverty? Is it perpetuating low-wage work? You know, in your experience, we obviously have a safety net. We spend a lot of money on it, but it has a very different character from what it did, obviously, 10 or 15 years ago. What does it look like to you?
Whoa, that's a super loaded question. Excuse me, and I'm getting over a really bad cold or whatever it is, so I'm sorry. The safety net, I think, you know, before the economic recession, what we seen time and time again was just like, you know, this blaming of people who receive public assistance. I'm a former public assistance recipient. Lived in a family that was evicted 5 times. Had to raise, you know, my son without a job and, you know, and all of that. So there was always like this shame, like this huge shame about going out to get it. And since the recession, we've seen like the renaming of some assistance programs, particularly the SNAP benefits program. They made it like a little, you know, like, oh, it's okay now.
Made it snappy.
Yeah, it made it snappy. Like, you know, we still call it food stamps in the office, you know. And so, you know, like there's a bit of like no wordplay and just how like that shifted what the face of poverty looks like. What we do know, right, and we're looking at, you know, what's been going on in the past several years, what's been happening in the Bloomberg administration. What we've also been seeing is just like this huge move to privatize what are safety nets for many of our communities, right? Which, you know, if you want to take the argument with a grain of salt that, you know, like the federal government, the state, and the city don't have enough money to carry all these programs, but there still is a huge need for things such as housing and food and other forms of public assistance. And when we, you know, at Fury, we look at safety net as like not just like the normal, the way that we think about, you know, public assistance, but also housing and education and all the things that help to make a family or a person whole, to move them in a sustainable way out of poverty. And, you know, particularly with public housing, which is like the big issue for Fury and organizations such as Community Voices Heard and Good Old Lower East Side and Mothers in the Move, which are all member-led organizations that are doing fantastic work, is that we're seeing like a huge shift towards, you know, thinking of public housing as assets that can be marketed out to private developers, right? Where we know consistently for the past several years that the Housing Authority has lost billions because HUD, you know, traditionally it goes to Congress with a budget that is way smaller than what they need. They get that amount, but what that results in is just like, you know, impacts to the repairs in public housing where buildings are getting more and more unsafe. I mean, Fury took the city to court because one member started coughing up blood, which is the amount of mold that she had in her apartment that was going on for 2 years. And she didn't have a repair ticket until December of 2014. And what now was that doing is like, you know, laying this path, and we've seen it with the infill project where, you know, the Housing Authority is pretty much saying like, look, we can't handle this $7 billion backlog in repairs that we have right now. We have to begin to sell off some property. But what that's opening in a city where we've seen a shift towards privatizing education and a shift towards privatizing other services, and pretty much removing the responsibility of government, right, to do what government is supposed to do with taxpayer dollars, which is, you know, take care of its citizens and make sure that communities are moving in a way towards, you know, economic stability. And so opening up, like, you know, these kind of avenues threaten the amount of safety nets that are available. When we also hear about cash assistance, it's like flatlining and so on, we have to think about, well, how many families have been decertified because they've been on it for too long, right? Or refused to go to a work experience program assignment because they just couldn't figure out the childcare part of it, or, you know, due to illness and so on. And so, like, you know, these are things that we have to pay attention to, because when NYCHA, I'm not going to say if, because, you know, because they've had in the past, have demolished, you know, portions of their developments, it hasn't been one-for-one replacement, right? And we've seen that historically throughout New York City, and even in private development schemes that we've seen throughout the city, where if we've seen like rows of houses being demolished, it was never one-for-one replacement. It doesn't discount the fact in a city with a growing population, and thus you can think proportionately that the poverty gap is going to continue to widen, particularly for certain groups of people. That, you know, like all of a sudden, like, there is no need for affordable housing. Bloomberg likes to say that he's created 165 affordable housing throughout New York City. Well, 200,000 were lost, right? Like during his tenure here as well, and closing down community centers that people are very much in need of, right? Like, we don't think about community centers as something that's important, but it is. While in the same hearing, to hear that the Economic Development Corporation owes the city of New York $200 million, you know, like, there's just like a huge, just kind of pink elephant that's sitting in a room that I think that people are starting to take notice. And so when we think about, you know, building a critical mass, it's not just less organized, the low-income people are in the room, but also realizing that it is a cross-sector approach that needs to be taken in order to really alleviate poverty. That we have to get social service organizations and policy organizations, legal organizations, and other resource-based groups, as well as academia and so on. Like, you know, we really have to come together and think about not just alleviating poverty from now, but how do we prevent it from being as cyclical as it is.
Jennifer, I want to talk about that for a second. You know, we have found, so the settlement houses today, the contemporary settlement house, I think they're both service providers, usually under contract with government, but they still retain some of that social reform approach, meaning in getting people engaged and organized around their own issues. But what we have found is, and not surprisingly, because people are stressed and busy, is that when there's a real tangible, concrete issue that affects them, like childcare after school, and some of you know that this is the second year in a row that the mayor's budget has seriously defunded, underfunded, two of those essential supports for working parents. We were able to get people out. We had tremendous participation last year at this time, budget time, of parents, working parents who are just like tired, you know, they have a lot to do. They came out because their program was going to be threatened. Their childcare, their after school. Similarly, we get young people around the whole summer jobs for youth issue, which is, again, another program that, even though the benefits are enormous, gets put on the chopping block every year. So what we've found, and I think our agencies, the settlement houses have found, is that when there's something very concrete, people will sign a petition, they'll go to a rally, they'll go to a town hall meeting, they'll meet with their elected official. But the more, you know, social justice, if you will, the more intangible is much harder in terms of creating a social movement. Whoever asked the question, I think you did. It's really hard. Most of the people we see are just struggling to get by. And one of the things I wonder about, as you talked about the transformation of the city's economy into a service economy, and you're going to have very well-paid people and very not well-paid people, is as more sort of formerly middle class or moderate income people are forced into that service economy at low wages, will that change how low-income people are viewed? You know, that they're not going to be morally destitute and lazy and stigmatized. I wonder if that will begin to change as that reality changes, that people who consider themselves hardworking and middle class are finding that they can't make it either. So I wonder if, in a kind of odd way, it will redefine what being poor is, or being poor will be redefined. Just a question.
That's a good one. In the time we have left for panel questions and answers, I want to talk briefly about the present and then kind of about the future. There obviously would be a lot to say about Mayor Bloomberg's 12 years in office, but in particular his promise in early 2006 to make a dramatic or substantial, I think was the word, reduction in family poverty in New York, which gave birth to the Commission on Economic Opportunity, which in turn birthed the Center for Economic Opportunity. I don't want to always start with Ethan, open this up to the group. When any of us are writing our book of the next 50 years of poverty in New York City or working against it, how will Bloomberg's effort, how will CEO be remembered? Will there be a takeaway from that? Will there be a positive legacy? Will it be a mix? Valerie, what do you think of what the mayor has accomplished in terms of his, I know you talked about some of his other policies, but specifically his anti-poverty policy. Is there anything that you take away positive, or what's your critique of that?
I'm just waiting
In
for
5
December
minutes.
31st. I'm just waiting for December 31st at this point. Bloomberg's legacy, in our view, has been largely about bringing in people, like John Ray is a banker with no housing experience whatsoever. And so it's bringing in people who are thought to be experts, and we don't take away what people learn and, you know, what they've gone through in their lives and so on. But it's also been largely about silencing the voices of people who are directly impacted, right? To be at those decision-making tables in a really authentic way, right? We go to public hearings and they feel like therapy sessions where you're just talking and there's like no feedback coming to you really. And that gets to be frustrating as it goes along. It's almost as if, like, you know, they come in and they enter the stage with their minds already made, and no matter what kind of arguments that you have to, you know, either preserve housing or preserve education as a public resource, it feels like, you know, you're just speaking to people who are too busy playing on their Blackberries or something. Bloomberg's legacy for us has also been about criminalizing poverty in a way that's not as apparent, you know. So when communities are being redeveloped, you'll see what we call the overseer towers, right? Like the police towers going in and increasing quality of life laws to stop and frisk, which is, like, you know, tremendously impacted communities in ways that, you know, people have records where I'm scared to let my 16-year-old son walk out the door. Bloomberg's legacy has also been about, like, you know, let's try to make New York City like London, you know, and we're like, no, why not make New York City look like New York City the way that we want it to be? And then finally, Bloomberg's legacy, I think, is just, like, you know, creating so many slippery slopes in perpetuating poverty in a way that we're not going to really predict, right? When we talk about, like, the numbers of poverty going down, for us, when we did census work, we found, like, not too many people even trust the government to even, you know, get things done. And I think that's also, like, you know, a fallout from Bloomberg's administration.
So full disclosure, I was on the commission. See, I was on the commission, she wasn't. I'm wearing the suit, you see. I think the Center for Economic Opportunity, I don't think, you know, these issues about social services and poor people are not the mayor's issues. When he was a private citizen, he put his charitable dollar into Lincoln Center and the 92nd Street Y. He didn't even put it into Henry Street Settlement. So I think it's not his passion. So I think it was sort of half-hearted. You know, when Deputy Mayor Gibbs, I think, was trying to, you know, in fairness, show that innovative practices could work. I think it's been a mixed record of the programs that the Center for Economic Opportunity has funded, and I don't think much of it will outlast the administration.
I mean, I think the Center for Economic Opportunity is a great thing. I think that in the long run, the historians that write the next book will see it as window dressing. Because, I mean, to come in and have kind of to claim that you're going to make that kind of progress. And I think some of the things they've done are great. The new poverty line work, I mean, changed federal policy as well. The conditional cash transfer work was really interesting, but then they pulled the plug on the program before it was really even done. And at the same time, you have things like homelessness increasing. You know, in all fairness, there's a recession that Bloomberg could have anticipated. There just seems to be a real disconnect between this very data-driven, intensive work that the CEO does and some of the other policies of the administration. And so I think in the long run, because Bloomberg ends with homelessness at such a high rate and poverty at such a high rate, that it won't look like much.
So a final question before we throw it open, and this is looking forward. We have a mayoral race on now, and whoever wins that race is going to bring a lot into office in terms of their assumptions and background. It's almost too cliche to mention the cliche that, you know, if you don't understand the lessons of history, you're doomed to repeat them. You're probably also doomed to not replicate some successes, and I think there have been some in this history we're talking about. So if we were to give a historical briefing to the person who's going to win and take Gracie Mansion and City Hall in January, a single historical lesson from recent history, from far past history, that we feel would equip them. What would come to mind? Any ideas? So in other words, if we had to highlight something in the book that showed them in the elevator?
It's hard to pick a single lesson. I think that the lesson of the whole book, or of history in general, is to use some caution. To not try and make the problems that you see fit the solutions you already have. And to not have those preconceptions that you come in with. I think time and again, we see over the history, there's preconceptions about who the poor are, what the poor are like, what they need. And that's what drives public policy, and that's what drives private action, rather than really trying to figure out what's going on. Obviously, there's a timeline. People have to start doing stuff right away, but I'd like to see a new mayor, rather than coming in with their platform that they've talked about in these debates, to really try and figure out what policies would work better.
It's hard to imagine my saying this because I'm a great David Dinkins loyalist, and I worked for the man for many years and fought conscious policies, but we need a multi-billion-dollar housing plan. I think that one of the things that Koch set into motion before he left office was a 10-year housing plan. It's kind of gone now. At the root of homelessness is housing. And so unless there is, and all the mayoral candidates, of course, will say that it's a federal responsibility, but we see what the federal government isn't doing, and Koch did it. And believe me, I was no Koch fan. Koch did it, he set it into motion, it made a difference. I think we got to do it again.
I agree that I'm unsure about a single lesson. I think that it is possible, and we've seen it in many occasions, to address public policy with the notion that all life has value, and that there are things that are basic human rights, right? Like housing is a human right, the right to not live in. I've never met a person who said that they loved and enjoyed living in poverty, and so I would say that the lesson is definitely. I think Digital Homeless says it best in their tagline, like talk to us, not about us. Have conversations with people who are living through it, to hear out what's been the impact and to hear what kind of changes that they would like to see.
Makes sense. All right, so we have about half an hour for questions, and I'm hoping there are a few. So if you could keep it to questions and not comments, we'll be mingling afterwards. You can comment all you want then, but let's start in the back.
Thank you. Richard Jordan, president of Concerned Citizens Speak. It's a local 32-year-old citizens organization. Thank you, first of all, for copies of the book and for all of the good handouts. Ethan, I have a specific question concerning the book. In the index, looking through the index, I noticed it 3 distinct areas that are not mentioned. One, and I've got it written on the back of a business card, the role of socially conscious movies in the 1930s. Wild Boys of the Road, I Was a Prisoner on a Chain Gang. 2, the role of local civic organizations in this area that worked with the religious institutions. And 3, the role of Protestant and other faith traditions, Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, Madison Avenue Presbyterian, Calvary St. George's, Moravian Coffee Pot, not in the book. Could you just say why they don't appear? Thank you.
Let me see if I can do all that list. So, movies of the 1930s. The second was
civic institutions in this area.
In this area, and the
Religious.
religious. Yeah, I mean, I think all those the movies I have to take a pass on. Those we don't get to at all. There's things that end up on the cutting room floor. I think we touch on it. The decisions were made about what the book was about, and I really wanted it to have the voice of the families and individuals that are experiencing poverty to be there. But I also wanted it to be a broader public policy history. And so while we touch on the role of community organizations, it's not a robust part of the book. In terms of Protestant organizations, it's there. Not every church is there, but there's a real discussion of how there's a transition from a system that's based basically in church-based giving to broader systems of charity and to public charity. So not every organization made it into the index. It's a long history of a large city, but we did our best.
Other questions?
Obviously, poverty is extremely complex, and I like what Ethan said about not thinking of policy for mayoral candidates to think about policies before they become mayors and be open to what people say. If each of you had one pet policy that you would just love to see passed in the next 3 years, what is it that you would pick to be passed? You can pick two if you want to.
Well, maybe it's just because of what's happened in the last couple of years, but I think it is just shameful that we don't have enough childcare to go around. Early childhood education, I mean, the research is there, the studies are there, the money's not there. And I think that makes a huge difference to all people, but particularly to low-income people. And then, I have to go back to housing because a lot of my background was involved with this. In the absence of the federal government providing housing subsidies, I mean, Section 8 exists, we need a local Section 8 type program. It's the only thing that's going to allow people low income to stay in the city. It's expensive. Hey, look, a budget is an expression of priorities. So I would say childcare and housing support, housing subsidies.
My two policies would be around accountable community or economic development with enforceable community benefits agreements that wouldn't allow developers just renege on things such as promises to build affordable housing on their sites and so on. And the second is increased low-income housing throughout New York City. Affordable housing is largely not affordable for people who are living in poverty. And just thinking about how many people are in the emergency assistance unit and families who are doubling up, I think there needs to be a push towards building more low-income housing for folks.
I mean, I'll basically take a pass. I mean, I think the homelessness, that's what we work on, and I think we need a real reevaluation of policies around homelessness in the city in general, which includes things like housing, but just a more robust system to deal with really a crisis in family homelessness.
One of the interesting things is that we've been to mayoral forums, they're not really talking about homelessness. I mean, back in the day, about 20 years ago, it was the forefront of everybody's mind. It's receded. And I think it has to do with what I said earlier, that it's not visible. I mean, the best thing for the affordable housing movement in the city was homelessness, because the people were forced to do something, because everybody was stepping over homeless people in Grand Central. Not the case anymore. Not to sound cynical.
Hi, I think that Controller John Liu, I heard on the Brian Lair show this morning that he's trying to live on however little money people who get food stamps are living on for 1 week, and so he's trying to raise that issue a little bit, and I wonder if you're aware of that, and I'm not sure if there's another candidate who's also doing that, but do you have any comment, or do you think it'll do any good? Thanks.
Like living in public housing as he does it. I mean, I can't, I am a director of a 501c3 organization, so nothing I say represents my endorsement or non-endorsement of anyone, but I think it's insulting, these publicity stunts that rich people take to say like, I'm gonna spend a month living on the amount that people get for food stamps or SNAP subsidies, and you know, and I'm all over TV with it. Like, we don't get to be all over TV when we're trying to figure out, you know, with the $6 we got left after public assistance, you know, do we take a cab or do we get on a bus to get to the supermarket that's 1.5 miles away? You know, it's whack.
I just want to mention, I think he's already said that it's not really doable and that he was like trying to express some kind of sympathy, and I hope he'll say that the amount should be raised.
We could have told him that.
But you don't think that, I mean, I'm also not in the business of making endorsements, but you don't think that, I mean, obviously he gets some credit for it, but doesn't it bring attention to just how paltry that benefit is? I mean, you know that, he knows that, but most people don't know that. Isn't there some benefit to that?
Yes, I mean, there are some benefits towards, like, you know, raising awareness, and then what happens after, you know, that social experiment is over, right? Like, what happens? And I think that's a large question for many of us, and there are many groups that have come together. Our cities, our homes coalition have come together as a coalition. We're in 40 different housing groups all across the city are coming together, and we're holding a mayoral forum next Tuesday. I don't have the details, and I can't retain too much information today. And so, you know, there is some benefit in shedding light to, like, you know, here is the plight of people who are going through it, but I'd rather, like, just really hear out, like, you know, here's my concrete plan for getting families out of it day one.
You'd previously spoken about, I guess, a possible need for public housing to become privatized. So other than the HUD-sponsored low-income housing tax credits, is there any other incentive, grant, subsidies, anything of that nature that is available for someone who's looking to either build or convert existing housing into affordable housing?
Oh, I would never say that public housing should be privatized. Is that what you're saying?
And not that it needs to, but there is, I guess, an availability for that option.
Yeah, I mean, the availability for that option is because of the decreased disinvestment in public housing. Increasing disinvestment in public housing has been going on for years. And, you know, privatizing public housing means that there's no longer, right, like, we all know, like, we can spend all day talking about, like, the dirty tricks of landlords and how they, you know, forcefully evict people out of their homes and raising the price point of rent to make it really unaffordable for people to live there. And as much as, you know, when we think about it in the city and the federal level, we can think about clearly, you know, if housing was receiving the same amount of attention as corporations do, right, and the same amount of funding they would do, like, it would be solved in a moment, right? And I think that falls in line with, like, you know, the poor are not deserving, or people who are working or are low income are not deserving of that kind of money, because there's an assumption like we don't contribute, you know, to the tax base here in the city. Yeah, right, and then here in New York, you know, the New York City Housing Authority that claims to, you know, right now we know that there's a $205 million budget gap that they have. $75 million of those dollars that could have been, you know, plugging up that gap is going towards the New York Police Department, right? To have the police department go through the hallways and check who's staying there illegally or not, and give them out tickets and so on. But private landlords get that same service free from the Clean Halls program, you know. And so, like, there's a lot of mismanagement in, like, larger, you know, in public housing and how that money is being spent. That we feel that, you know, in a city where the city council has no authority over the public housing authority here, where state officials could have, you know, probably stepped up a little bit more to think about how management and money is happening. But then also from the federal government that pretty much says, hey, it's okay, you know, you do whatever you want, we're gonna turn a blind eye until somebody puts it in the media. And in terms, like, you know, are there grants that are available to build? I don't know what those grants are specifically, like, we don't do community development. But I'm sure, like, you know, there are many programs that give, you know, lots and lots of tax abatements. You know, I would suggest maybe looking up, like, you know, nonprofit developers that have been developing affordable housing to see what kind of funding was available to them. The mandate is, like, that mandate, it makes it voluntary for a landlord, a developer, or even a public housing authority to even enter into it. And it's a way for, like, you know, increasing, you know, because current HUD mandates call for, you know, for Section 8 affordable housing, public housing, to be billed at 30% of a family's income, right? And so the thinking is, if you can get families to work, you can bring in more revenue towards that housing, which, you know, is usually based on your gross income and never based on what your net, you know, like what your net income actually is, which, you know, is another one of the criticisms of the program. Currently, I'm not quite sure about, like, what the impact has been. We know that in public housing and niche developments right now that the average rent that's being charged to tenants hovers around 22%, and not the full 30%. And so the housing authority is like beginning to use the Moving to Work program as a way to increase the rent revenue to match its rent rolls. But what that does is also like, just kind of creates the space of like, if you can't find a job, because everybody can find work in this economy nowadays, that also, they're putting in like all sorts of different things, like, forcing residents to perform community service at their public housing developments, and if you don't, it's considered a violation. And anybody knows when you violate any obnoxious rules, you get a letter to appear at 250 Broadway, which is a whole heap of madness, and can result in your ending your evicting you. And so like the Moving to Work program, I think, it's one of those things where like it sounds good on paper sometimes, but doesn't feel as if like there's been like a real think through or evaluation of it to figure out how to really make it work and help to make it sustainable for families who are there. Because basing your rent off of somebody's gross income and not their net income can really force families into the space of deciding, do you get food for your refrigerator or do you pay your landlord?